Hey John, how you doing?
I'm well, Alessio. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you very much. I want to welcome everyone to our webinar. Today's webinar is Political Risk in Latin America, returning to manageable level. I hope, John, is question that you can answer in the next half an hour. Is a very interesting question. For the information of the participant, this webinar is being recorded. The video will be available next week in YouTube. And we will be providing a link in case that you wanted to revisit or share it with some of your colleagues or friends. A brief introduction of Latam IB. I think most of you may be familiar as we initiate this event, this webinar, and we invite some of you, most of you. Latam IB is an investment banking boutique. We're based in Miami, in USA. And we focus on merger and acquisition in the Americas. I'm talking, including, of course, Latin America and the US. Latam IB is pleased to host John Price, Managing Director of America's Market Intelligence. He will share his insight on the Latin American current political situation and his economic impact in 2024. John is a well-recognized analyst with deep knowledge of Latin America with over 30 years experience in the region. He has helped many companies successfully navigate in the situation in Latin America. John, could you please introduce yourself and also American Market Intelligence? I think some of the participants may not be fully aware about your background and of course, the services provided by American Market Intelligence.
Well, thank you so much, Alessio. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity. America's Market Intelligence began under the brand Info Americas, which I and a couple of others founded in Mexico City 32 years ago. That company was sold to Kroll, who was interested in the time of getting into market intelligence. The purchase was made just prior to the economic or the financial crisis of 2008. So our team stayed about 4 years under the Kroll banner before we went independent again under the AMI brand in 2011. Throughout that time, we've helped companies, mostly companies that are already well vested in Latin America, make crucial decisions. Do I enter a market? Do I buy a company? Do I launch a product? How do I divide my marketing spend? How do I sustain my market share versus new competitors versus gray market competitors, et cetera? And those decisions are driven by information that we collect for them, be it from the customer, the competition, or the investment environment, political, economic, regulatory factors. So taking into account all those inputs, we come up with our analysis and our recommendations. So that's what we do for a living. We have people in our company who are very specialized in distinct sectors. I am the generalist, the jack of all trades, master of none, which puts me as a sort of common denominator on a lot of our projects, looking at things like political risk, economic forecasting, et cetera. So it's an area that I enjoy very much commenting upon and do so about 25 to 30 times a year, be it in a webinar or in front of a live audience. So thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation with you, Alessio.
Thank you very much again for joining us. For the audience, we will appreciate if you can include your question in the chat, and we will be answering at the end, as we just have half an hour for this event. I think make it a little bit more efficient. So if you can please, John, leave about 5 minutes at the end of this webinar to answer any question that we may have from the audience.
Sure. In fact, do we have 1 hour or half an hour, Alessio?
Half an hour. Sorry, John. Half an hour.
Half an hour. Okay, yeah.
If you wanted to stay longer, I'm happy to do so.
Sure.
I don't know.
No, we'll move quickly. Not a problem.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the first question is, compared to a year ago, John, it seems that the political agenda, political arena in Latin America has changed. I must say that also the investor sentiment were more pessimistic. I like to point out to a figure that indicate that in the since 2018, the last 22 presidential election has been won by the opposition in 20 occasions, which is quite significant, especially in our region. So what is your reading, the current reading of the political situation, and what has changed? Because I think we discussed it in a meeting that the outcome of the performance of the region in the last half, last quarter or second half of the year, it was more positive than anyone expected.
Well, that's right. And, as the title of this talk sort of infers, political risk seems to be coming down from where it was a year ago. Now, political risk is one of the more difficult areas of risk to quantify. A lot of it is driven by perception. And the perception of most investors a year ago was pretty dire. At that point in time, we had seen elected into office at the presidential level in the 7 largest economies of Latin America. 7, what would be sort of a simply, very crudely characterized as leftist populist leaders. And that historically has not gone well for Latin America when we have people of that political stripe in office. And so quite naturally, investors, based upon past experience, took a step back from the region. And I don't just mean financial investors. We work mostly with strategic investors, companies that operate in the region that are constantly trying to penetrate markets with their products and services. And they really took a step back in terms of investing in any growth, cut budgets dramatically in the region, especially for the first half of 2023. The other factor was the US. The US looked like the NASDAQ had fallen some 30% in the latter half of 2022. And the US economy, everyone was calling for a recession. Well, it turns out that the US economy didn't do that badly, nor did Latin America do that badly. And the political risk was probably overstated. And the reasons are really boiled down to 2 factors, I would say. One is a maturing voter. As the Argentines like to say, si a los 20 años no eres de la izquierda, eres inhumano. Si a los 40 no eres de la derecha, eres sonso. We tend to mature in our political thinking as we get older because we have more to lose. And so we're less likely to call for radical change. And I think that voters were crucial in stemming and pulling back on the reins of some instincts of political leaders who really wanted to change things. I speak of Chile with Boric. I speak of Colombia with the midterm elections, where Petros and his party suffered great defeats, and his chosen candidate suffered great defeats. And the other big factor, something that doesn't get a lot of enough press, I think, is the steady institution building that's been going on in Latin America now for 30 years. And ahead of that list, atop of that list, is the role of central banks. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, but central banks, when you had populist leaders taking over with grand ideas of change, but fiscally constrained, the central bank was an additional brake on their ability to do things. And by raising interest rates, they not only stemmed inflation, but they made it very difficult and costly and almost impossible for these governments to go out and borrow money and spend it on the kind of programs they wanted to. But we also had judiciary in places like Colombia acting as an important brake. We have Congress. I mean, very few presidents today have any kind of control, majority control in Congress. And congressional leaders are much more self-assured in their ability to confront presidential authority. So for all of these reasons, we really saw the bold ideas and the bold reforms and the scary reforms from an investment point of view of leaders in places like Peru and Chile at the beginning, certainly Colombia, really held back by institutional counterweight. So that is, I think, something that doesn't get a lot of coverage, but is terribly important to long-term investors.
Thank you, John. John, if you don't mind, we have prepared a poll, which I will try to launch at this time to give you an idea where is the audience located. Let me, yeah, sorry, I'm having some issues here. Yeah, no. Unfortunately, I'm able to activate it. Let me try while we cover the second question.
Sure.
The second is about, I mean, at this time of the year, you know, there are significant global risk, political issues. I mean, I don't want to list all of them, but, you know, there are situation in Middle East, you know, war in Ukraine, you know, U.S. elections is relevant, I guess. So I was wondering, what is your view? How impacted is Latin America, you know, under these global risks or geopolitical issues? I wanted to mention something that I read, a very interesting comment. I think it's the America's Quarterly, part of the Council of Americas, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned something like, you know, it's relatively bullish, positive about Latin America, but say something like, you know, Latin America is far from all this geopolitical situation, and it's very close to the U.S., which he see it, you know, as an opportunity. So what can you comment on you know, what is the impact in Latin America or all these global risks that we facing nowadays?
Sure. Well, it's an interesting dichotomy because Latin America, in many ways, is the most globally exposed region in the world. It's the one region that depends most on the export of its most successful exports, which is commodity. It relies on global markets. It relies on global markets to feed it capital. It relies on global partners to feed it technology. So it is definitely a region that historically has been very susceptible to contagion from global economic risk. And you're right, this time of year is when firms like Eurasia Group come out with their sort of top 10 global risks. A lot of investment banks publish things that are similar. But if you look at those risks and the ones that they point out, they really are, some of them are very relevant to Latin America. Some of them actually are counterweights. Now, it's difficult to speak of the tragedy in places like the Middle East and the Ukraine as a positive for Latin America. But the reality is that what we've seen historically when there is conflict in these two areas, these are two areas that are two of the most important suppliers of petroleum and petrochemicals to the world markets. And when we have conflict in either of those areas, that raises the price of those products. Now, there are Latin American countries, particularly Central American, Caribbean, that are net importer of these products, and they suffer as a result. But many of the larger economies in Latin America today are either net exporters of energy products or pretty balanced of trade when it comes to energy products. And so an increase in the price of energy net is a positive for Latin American economies. Again, it's disturbing to think that that comes at the expense of such tragedy, but the reality is that those risks are not necessarily going to hurt Latin America. The other thing that you point out is people involved in supply chain, people involved in, you know, European companies looking for growth who might have looked east, who might have relied on the Russian and Russian satellite markets for a lot of their exports, are now actively looking elsewhere for middle income countries for their products and have taken a renewed interest in Latin America. The US political scenario, and I think really the risk that was pointed out by Eurasia, is not so much the election, but just how divisive politics has become in the United States, it does become material to Latin America on a country by country basis, particularly small markets where US support still makes a difference. I mean, Guatemala is a great example. I don't think that Arevalo would have been able to assume office if Trump was in power. I think the Biden administration exercised enormous pressure on the rather concentrated political and economic powers to be in Guatemala to allow the guy who won the election to assume office, in spite of the fact that they didn't want that to happen. So I think that how Venezuela negotiates the opening of its oil and gas markets and the investment by companies in it going forward will very much be influenced by who becomes president in Washington. But overall, region-wise, the US economy will continue to be an important customer for Latin America. American companies will continue to be a source of investment for Latin America, regardless of who wins that election. And as you go around sort of these global risks, you realize that not all of them are particularly important for Latin America. Most risk in Latin America is homegrown, not external.
Yeah, okay. So it means that probably, based on your comments and this article that I mentioned before, it seems that, some of these will be opportunities, considering all the geopolitical situation worldwide, no? Okay, thank you. I think I got the poll. I asked the audience about where are they located. I think it give you some perspective, John. I hope,
Sure.
It's been launched, so I appreciate everyone. If you can please just include, this is anonymous, of course, and it just as a reference, no more than that. Just a couple of seconds, John.
Sure.
Okay, I think you can also look at the result, John.
I think you need to publish. I don't see them yet. I don't know if you
Okay,
have to publish
I
the
give you
results.
a summary, but yeah,
Perfect.
US is the most relevant. I mean, we organize it by alphabetical order. So, the US is about 40%. We have, Colombia, Argentina, and Central America quite close to 10%. There are some people, in Mexico is another 15%. And we have other people connecting from, Dominican Republic, Chile, and Peru will be the rest. But the US is certainly the biggest. My last question, because we hope we can have the last 5 minutes to answer question, as I mentioned before, is if political risk in Latin America is less concerning now than before, what other risks, investor in the region should be worried about? I mean, in order to operate in Latin America.
Well, one of the things that I think is a new challenge for companies and for people who are responsible for their sort of corporate image, government relations, even public relations, is the social media impact on politics. So in most countries in Latin America, the importance of parties and the discipline that came with political parties and the concentration of authority that came with political parties began to dismantle some time ago. But social media has kind of taken it at an even more accelerated pace. Even countries like Mexico, which traditionally had very stable parties, even Colombia, that's had very stable party system, is beginning to show a weakness of parties and the rising and ascendant importance of the individual, the character, the personality. And that's just in the politics, but it also speaks to things like the ability of social campaigns led often by celebrities and others who attack a new product or attack a company who are, you know, in opposition to how that company is managing its business in their country. And they can't go to the authorities and get help from them because the authorities really don't have the power themselves to wrestle with this popular uprising against them. And it's you know, this is a worldwide phenomenon, but it is a whole new challenge to Latin America in terms of maintaining good reputation in the market. Another that we've seen sadly in Ecuador is the power, the enormous power, and even sophistication of organized crime groups in Latin America and their ability to challenge authority, to tactically take over small regions of countries, to their soft power and their ability to govern in more remote parts of certain countries where the government is ineffective or essentially corrupted. And you know, in some cases, they are the sort of Robin Hood governance of some of these small communities and seem almost innocuous. But ultimately, their power as it grows is a challenge to government. And that ultimately is a destabilizing force. So I think that Latin America struggles to deal with organized crime. When it is successful, it often comes at great expense, whether it was the civil war in Peru, whether it's what's going on today in El Salvador. It comes at great expense to the judicial system, to innocent lives, et cetera. So this is a real power problem. Another is, you know, the judiciary in Latin America used to be weak, and very much under the thumb of acting governments. And therefore, as long as you had the government on your side, the judiciary was not much of a risk you had to contend with. Now we have increasingly independent judiciaries, which in principle is a good thing, but some of them are quite politicized. And in Brazil, we've seen this. Lula appointed much of the Supreme Court in Brazil, and his kind of revenge politics of his first year in politics, which is really driven by the fact that he feels he was sent to jail by certain interested parties, and he's been after them. He spent a lot of his political capital domestically in his first year pursuing that kind of revenge, and he's done it with the assistance of a highly politicized judiciary. So the judiciaries that are appointed and that act politically, I think ultimately is a form of risk. If you are operating in Chile, you may have the support of the government. You may have a good mining project, but if the local judiciary is against it and is siding with political opponents to that, or rather grassroots opponents to your project, that's a real problem for you. So these are, you know, the risk profile in Latin America is growing more diverse and sophisticated. It's not just the presidency that matters. It's a whole diversity of actors. So I'll stop there. We've got some great questions that have already come in.
Yes.
And I'm happy to address some of them.
A few of them, John, making the most of these last 5 minutes, few of them are asking about China influence in the region. Again, there are a couple of them, actually 3 question related. I will try to summarize, but, you know, what are your thoughts on, you know, a recent announcement about China, investing more aggressively or more strategically in the region? What will be the influence? You know, also, you know, they are in the past also they have focused on natural resources. So what is your view about China and of course the response of political response from the US?
Sure. So it's a big and diverse question. You know, Chinese strategy in Latin America has several pillars. The first of which, like you pointed out, is their ability to secure long-term sources of natural resources. So Japan and Korea went through something similar in the 70s and 80s, where they recognized that their own industrialization was at risk if they couldn't guarantee long-term supplies. Back then, resource prices were low, particularly in the 80s. So they secured them through long-term contracts with sort of politically risky suppliers, whether it was, Angola, Sudan, Iraq, Iran, etc. China, in an age of higher resource prices, but in an age also where they're sitting on huge amounts of dollar reserves that they keep accumulating to keep their currency low and their manufacturing sector competitive. Their prerogative is to secure natural resources by purchasing outright these companies. And so they've done a lot of that, whether it's oil and gas, agricultural goods, and industrial metals. And of course, China, there's no secret, is trying to take a dominant position in the metals that will be driving the sort of EV markets going forward, as well as the electronics industry going forward. So these are highly coveted metals. Latin America has a disproportionate number of those. So that's a big part of it. Another big part is remember, Chinese leadership has always been concerned with unemployment, with idle people in their country who are no longer willing to make the trade-off between limited freedoms and economic growth. So economic growth is absolutely fundamental to their political survival of the party. And to do that, they also need to keep people employed. So the Belt and Road is in part of it is to literally generate job growth for the engineering firms and for all those people, idle labor, that they can get involved in those projects. They also have, China no longer today is a maquiladora the way it was 30 years ago. It has over 50 car companies with probably 200 car brands. And they need to sell those products and lots of other Chinese branded products. And middle income countries is where they're most likely to do that. And Latin America tops that list. So they're interested in maintaining market access. They're interested in maintaining relatively low tariff treatment of their products coming into these markets. And that's a big part of their diplomatic push, is for those commercial goals to be met. Now, are there nefarious sort of additions that come along with this increased trade and investment and lending that they're doing into Latin America? Sure. Is it much different than the sort of mindset of lenders and investors in strategic industries like energy and telecommunications and the like, transportation, that came out of Europe into Latin America in the past, that came out of the US into Latin America in the past? I'm not so sure. So is it a threat to US interests? Absolutely. But I don't know that it's as nefarious as we worry, as much as it's just commercial competition. I don't foresee Chinese military threat directly to the United States being launched from anywhere in Latin America, as some people would speculate. I see this as more a tug of war of commercial interests more than anything. I want to address Adam Blanco's question on Russia, because first of all, Adam is an absolutely brilliant analyst. He's, in my mind, the top Russian analysts available to readers in the United States today. He has a fantastic newsletter that goes out, and he asked a very interesting question of what has Russia got to do with the détente, the energy-driven détente between the U.S. and Venezuela? And it's a very interesting question. The oil refinery factories of the U.S. Gulf Coast, particularly in Texas, that are some of the only refiners in the world who can work with Venezuela's heavy crude, can also work with Russian crude, which is not quite as heavy as Venezuela's, but is also a low-grade crude. And when Venezuela was first sanctioned, energy-wise, back in 2017, the Russians filled that gap. And it was Russian oil that was being bought by these refiners and being used. And when that was cut off because of sanctions against Russia as a result of their invasion of Ukraine, that put new pressure, economic pressure, on those refiners to reopen supply through Chevron from Venezuela. And that has been the economic impetus behind the aperture of relations with Venezuela. I personally think it is I understand the geopolitical larger point of view. You know, if you're Western Europe and you're United States and you know you're reliant upon petroleum and gas for at least another 30 years, and you're not going to be getting it from Russia, and it's always complicated to get it from the Middle East, it makes sense to open up the world's largest oil reserves to exploitation. But I don't understand the short-term political calculation. And by that, I mean the following. Who is benefiting from this? Refineries in Texas. Texas, for the last 30 years at the presidential US elections, has voted Republican. Florida, on the other hand, is a swing state. It's become a little bit more Republican, but it's still a swing state. And by trying to negotiate with somebody as, I think, crudely Machiavellian as the Maduro administration in Venezuela, Biden is going to lose that from the PR that's going to come out of that. The Republicans are going to exploit the heck out of it. Biden, I think the Biden camp lost Florida in the last election in small part because they weren't tough enough on Cuba and on Venezuela. And I think that could easily repeat itself here. I think that ultimately the Americans will be disappointed by what Venezuela is moving towards in terms of its own election and the freedom of candidates to run. And they'll end up losing Florida as a result, and they've already lost Texas. So I don't understand the political calculation there. Gas prices are not going to be marketably changed by an extra 200,000 or 300,000 barrels of oil coming into Venezuela, from Venezuela into the United States. So it's an interesting geopolitical shift. I think it's tactically a political mistake by the Biden administration.
Thank you, John. Again, if you have a couple of more minutes, probably the last question I see in the screen is regarding Colombia. You know, last week, S&P downgraded Colombia to negative. What is your current view about major risks for investors looking to deploy capital in Colombia?
Well, I think it's not just Colombia, as the question kind of leads to. Look, the world has changed. 3 years ago, the cost of money in the United States was close to zero, which meant that the cost of money, even in politically risky environments in Latin America, was, 5-6% above US rates. And so you could fund a project, let's say a solar power project in Colombia that promised 8 or 9% return. You could fund that in a world where risk adjusted cost of money in Colombia in dollars was, 5-6%. But today, US Treasury bills pay you close to 5%. So why on earth would you fund a project in Colombia that's going to return 9%? That's insane. And so, so the pressure, we have two colliding forces. On the one hand, COVID and the gross mismanagement of COVID by mostly technocratic governments in Latin America that really blew it, frankly. It worsened the distribution of income. It really revealed how tone deaf they were to the needs of their people. And so that generated this voter anger and this anti-incumbency that moved us towards populism and moved us more to the left. And on the other hand, you have far more restrictive interest rates in the United States have moved up faster during this cycle than in any cycle in history. And so that is a dramatic redrawing of the investment map and a dramatic redrawing of investment returns and how they're calculated versus risk. So on the one hand, you have higher perceived political risk. And on the other hand, you have lower tolerance for risk. That's not good for any country that looks. If your political campaign is built upon defaming capitalism, you're quickly going to find out that nobody wants to park their money in your country. And that's what's happened in Colombia very quickly.
Yeah, they have the allocation capital policy. Is not particularly keen on the current policies in Colombia. We have some more questions that we will try to answer.
And I have plenty of time, so I know there's still 100 people on the call, and certainly happy to stay on.
Happy to continue.
Yeah.
I think people get excited with some of the question. Let me see. Another question is particular. You mentioned something about Argentina, how you see the transition in Argentina, and also Milei speech in last week in Davos. So if you wanted to make some comment on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, look, Milei is a really interesting political phenomenon, in many ways unique. And let me just, before I comment on Milei, I just want to answer a doubt that I think some people have expressed, and that is that, as far as I know, Alessio, you'll be sending the full recording out to everybody that registered for this event. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Okay,
I was
perfect.
leaving that comment to the end, indeed. Yes.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So Milei is truly a unique political force, in that he is philosophically very much tied to the idea of libertarianism. And libertarianism does not have much of a history in Latin America. There's certainly been, a lot of people associate libertarianism, they think of it in purely economic terms. And certainly, the 1980s and 90s with the neoliberal movements across much of Latin America, people might understandably mistake that for libertarianism. That's not libertarianism, that's liberal economics, but libertarianism also got to do with social issues. And it's really about, I want choice in my life, and I don't want you, the government, to tell me how to live. So, for instance, there's not a lot of attention paid to Milei's position on social issues. It's mostly on economics, and that is, the burning problem in Argentina. But on social issues, for instance, with gay marriage and LGBTQ rights, he's completely laissez-faire. He's like, it's not my choice, it's not my life, it's your life, you decide. And that is, Latin America's brand of politics is driven partly by economics and whether you're laissez-faire or state intervention, but it's also driven by the influence of church and of Catholic, moral concepts that have driven much of the social policies in Latin America. It's also driven by the perceived need of a paternalistic state to provide for the poor and to provide social safety nets for big portions of the population. And libertarianism, contrasts many of those traditional political forces in Latin America. So it's quite unique that way. But his comments in Davos really were focused on economics. And, he was pretty bold with his language in terms of saying, only private monies and only private citizens and only individuals can create wealth. The government does not create wealth. And I think he's largely correct. I think that government has an important role to play in terms of collecting taxes, guaranteeing physical security for its citizens, guaranteeing legal security for its people and its companies, providing a basic education and healthcare. But the government really, has been proven time and time again, is not very effective at creating innovation. It's not very effective at creating companies. It's not very effective at providing services that could easily be provided by private companies. And so it is we've gone from neoliberalism, which everyone embraced in the 80s, and globalization, to a rejection of that, to a Tony Blair third way, trying to balance the two, to something more statist in the name of fairness, also paid for by high resource prices from 2003 to 2012, to a kind of a political no man's land where you had a mixture of everything, to COVID anger, and rejecting the incumbency, which were mostly technocrats, and embracing populism, to where we are today, which is populism is not working economically. But there isn't a sort of political philosophy that people have grabbed onto is going to save them going forward. And so this becomes a very curious new way of thinking. And we're already seeing libertarian parties sprouting up in Uruguay, Chile, Brazil. I think that Argentina's, if he's successful, and that remains to be seen, I think we will see an impact on the political landscape in its neighboring countries, Uruguay and Chile, both of which, like Argentina, have relatively high levels of education, a certain amount of basic infrastructure and income that allows them to think about more aspirational political ideas. It's not going to have a big impact in Central America, where high crime and low incomes put them in a wholly different political trajectory than the Southern Cone.
Thank you, John. I mean, I hope, as you said, we have quite a bit of people still engaged in the webinar. There is a question about Mexico, which is probably one of the most important presidential election coming for this year in Latin America. I mean, the question is regarding considering the potential continuity of the current party. What is your view about this implication for the rest of the region? I mean, I'm adding that part. And also, I mean, if you have 1 more minute as well, is that I find interesting that there is a high probability that the first woman is selected in Mexico. I mean, that's added for me. It's not in the question of these.
Sure.
Yes.
No, I think the fact that Mexico's political choices are basically narrowed on 2 female candidates is groundbreaking for sure. It's groundbreaking for Mexico, where when compared to places like Brazil, Colombia, and Chile, there is a lack of women in power, not just politically, but also in business circles. So I think it is very groundbreaking. Mexico is a very different political animal from most of Latin America, and you could write a thesis on that, but it often bucks the trend of much of other Latin America politically, and in part because it has a 6-year presidential term without the chance for re-election. So it's constitutionally designed quite differently from the rest of Latin America. It's important to remember that. We don't really know who Claudia Sheinbaum is and how she will govern. And I say that because in Mexico, there was a tradition for many, many years under the PRI, from the revolution till 2000. And frankly, I think AMLO's political instincts, which were formed in the era of the PRI when it was at its zenith of power in the 70s, and the Morena party is very much made in that light. And in the past, and we've seen repeatedly here with AMLO, there's the use of what they call the dedazo. The outgoing president essentially chooses his successor. And it has been tradition in Mexico that you don't say anything bad about the outgoing president until he's gone. And then you distance yourself from him and you form your own character and you put your own stamp on your own sexenio. And people say, well, AMLO is very popular, which makes him unique. Well, actually, with the exception of Peña Nieto, who was, just a political disaster, the previous presidents, both panistas and priistas, going back, they had 60% approval levels in the last year of their sexenio. So that is not unusual where AMLO is in terms of his level of popularity. It is not unusual in the level of vagueness expressed by the campaigning candidate who's been chosen by the outgoing president to be vague, to essentially be supportive of the outgoing president and his legacy of policies. People have speculated that AMLO, through his son, will try to build, as other Latin American leaders have done successfully in places like Argentina, the Dominican Republic, use the next person that they select in power to somehow sustain them and bring them back to power, in the case of Mexico through his son, that's not going to happen in Mexico. Sheinbaum will turn on AMLO just as every other Dedazo candidate has turned on their former president, and she will carve a path for herself. Now, what remains in doubt is policy area by policy area how she will act, but there's no doubt in my mind that she will be different from AMLO.
Thank you, John. I think we can conclude the session. I mean, I wanted to thank you and the audience, of course, for staying longer. I think I may have underestimated the interest of the audience in what you have to say and answering some of these key questions. So really appreciate again your time and the audience. As a reminder, we will be this has been recorded, and we will make it available via YouTube in the next week. And if anyone wanted to reach you or reach us, let us know. We will do it privately. But again, very interesting, John, and I think the participation of the audience was essential and with very interesting question. So have a good rest of the day, John, and the rest of the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessio. All the best.